Yeah, I guess before I start sharing with you a little bit about Malta, the interesting thing is everyone that I know from Fiji that has seen pictures of Malta, they're like, oh, it's so beautiful. Do you know what? I have the same reaction from people here when they hear that about Fiji. They're like, oh, it's such a paradise. I really, it's somewhere that people like aspire to go to. So I feel kind of blessed that I've got best of both worlds, like two islands in different hemispheres.
Yes.
So yeah, so Malta, I guess the first thing to know about Malta is there's actually a lot of similarities between the two countries. And so Malta is officially the Republic of Malta, or in Maltese, which is the language, Republica ta Malta. So it was formerly, before it was called that, it was formerly called Melita. Now, why I'm telling you that is because Malta has a very rich history. So the word Malta is actually derived from two different periods. It's actually the Greek word of Melitos, or the Roman word, which is, I believe it's Melita. So Melita, from the Roman times, actually meant honey. So it was the land of honey. And that's because Malta actually had apiary, which is beekeeping. There's places on the island where you have old apiaries from 2,000 years ago. So, which is really, like, it was just mind blowing for me. So where I was living up to a few months ago on the island, about 50 meters from my front door was one of the oldest beehives on the island. And so for me, it was just fascinating that literally you can walk out of your front door and you've got these old Punic tombs, you've got old, when we consider old in the South Pacific, I think we tend to think in terms of hundreds of years versus thousands of years. But that's the type of history that we're talking about, all the way from even 2,000 to 5,000 years before Christ. And so there's a lot, obviously with a country that's gone through that kind of history, there's so much that you can see and learn from it. But in terms of the country, it's actually an archipelago. So it consists of 7 islands. There's only 3 bigger ones that are actually inhabitable. So that's the islands of Malta, Gozo, and Camino. And in terms of the location, if you're trying to find where Malta is on the map, you'll have to look just below Italy. So we're about 80 kilometers from the south of Italy, and then we're about 280 kilometers from the north of Libya. So the top of North Africa, the south part of Europe, and we're kind of in the Mediterranean at a crossroads. And so if you think about historically, Malta was actually a very strategic part of the Mediterranean. And so it was for that reason that there's been many different, over the ages and down through the centuries, it's always been a key military or naval point, because if you had control of Malta, you had control of this part of the Mediterranean, and that was a strategic part of the world at the time. Whereas now, kind of the strategic part is kind of more Asia now, which is interesting how that's shifted geopolitically. So in terms of the historical parts of Malta, that's been recognized. We've got 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites here. So our capital city is one of them. So Valletta is the smallest European capital. And just to give you a sense of the size, because you might be thinking, okay, well, how big is this island? It's not big at all. Like, you can literally, in a day, go around the whole country. It is that small. So from the longest point of the island is from end to end is about 27 kilometers, and then the widest part is only 14 kilometers. So it's I think it might be even small. It might be smaller than Tabiuni actually, in terms of landmass. So it's not a large island at all. But the problem is our population is about 500,000. So if you can imagine 500,000 people on Tabiuni, that's very densely populated. So we actually have one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. So that's one of the things that is different about living here. Whereas in Fiji, unless you're in Suva or Lautoka, you're kind of like, those are kind of the only major urban areas. Whereas here, one urban area flows into another, and so green space or kind of countryside, that's what everyone loves. And so it's interesting how you always want something that you don't have, and that's something that I've seen true of many countries that I've lived in. And so one of the other interesting, there's two interesting sites that I would say on Malta in terms of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. One is the they're basically megalithic temples, and so that's the official name for them. But the word megalith, if you're not familiar with the word, it just simply means large, old, and it's usually to do with stones. So they usually, in Malta, most of it is limestone. And so you've got these massive, so one of the temples that I find really fascinating is a place called Haja-Im, and one of the biggest freestanding limestone megaliths there is estimated to weigh more than 20 tons. So these are huge stones that they built these temple structures out of. And even today, we don't know how they did them, like how they got those stones into place, or why. That the hypothesis is that they were used as places of worship, but the reality is we don't really know. We can, scientists and archaeologists can only, they can only believe that this is what happened in these places based off the structures and some of the things that they found there. But one of the things that these old sites teach us is that we think that modern humanity is clever, but these people that have built these structures, and we're talking about close to 3,000-4,000 years ago, these people understood astronomy, they understood mathematics and physics, because the way that this particular temple is built is there's a part of the stone called the porthole, so it's about this big, and that porthole is aligned, and it's aligned directly in terms of the winter solstice. So the winter solstice, the light will shine through that and light up the inner chamber. Now, that doesn't just happen by chance. You have to have calculated that. And so the winter solstice here happens in December. So for you guys, obviously, that's the summer solstice in the southern hemisphere or in the Pacific. The winter solstice happens the opposite, and the summer solstice obviously as well. So it's fascinating that and even on the equinox, which is the seasons, autumn and spring, that you have those also. The way that the front doors are aligned, the light shines at an angle, touches the side of the post, and then shines on a specific part of the chamber inside. And so to be able to do that takes amazing mathematics, as well as the physics to be able to put the stones in place so that they're freestanding. So it's absolutely amazing what the ancient civilizations were capable of.
Wow. Now I have to wish for COVID-19 to disappear so I can come over and see for myself.
Yeah,
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
super fascinating. And then I guess the only other two things that I think are probably interesting to mention is the first would be in more recent history. So I'm talking about AD 60, so 60 years after the birth of Christ. The Apostle Paul was shipwrecked in Malta. So for those of you that remember the biblical account of Paul being taken to stand trial from Jerusalem, going to Rome, he took a sea journey across the Mediterranean, and at some point they were shipwrecked, and that happened here. So where I live, the bay opposite is where it's called St. Paul's Island. So the area that I live in is St. Paul's Bay, and that's because that's where he was shipwrecked. So I think that's an interesting thing, and there's a monument on the island for that reason. So yeah, the recent history is also very interesting in terms of the account is spoken about even in the Bible. So if you want to have a look at that account, it's not lengthy, but you can read that in Acts chapter 27, and that's where it talks about him going from Jerusalem to Rome. And then I guess I've talked about it being an island nation in the middle of the Mediterranean between North Africa and Southern Europe. And so because of that, we're actually an external border for the EU. So for the European Union, for those of you that, I think you've all heard of it, but I don't know if everyone understands that the European Union is like a supra state in terms of it's made up of a lot of member states, which are individual countries. And so Malta is one of the countries on the external border. So it has other countries that aren't EU countries that border it. So for us, we've got Tunisia in North Africa, we've got Libya, and then further down the coast, there's obviously Egypt. So they're not a direct neighbor. But because we're an external border, one of the biggest challenges that we face, and also Italy as well, is refugees and migrants fleeing from North Africa. So fleeing from countries like the Sudan, Algeria, all these countries that you see in the news over the last 5 to 10 years, civil war. So you've got large populations in Africa being displaced. And to be honest, one of the things that, until I moved here, it was just something that I saw on the 6 o'clock news, right? And I've been guilty of this in the past, where you see these refugee crises, and you think, oh, these poor people, and you think Easter, they don't have a home. But it's just somebody that you see on television. What's changed for me is that seeing the actual impact of what these people, the lives that they lead, and they cross the Mediterranean, which is a dangerous thing because they pay human people smugglers. Often they give everything that they've got to either get themselves, their wives or their daughters, their children, to get them off or away from that conflict zone, and they send them to Europe for a better life. And so they pay these people, and they often get crammed into these small little, they're no bigger than punts really. So if you can imagine loading up a punt with maybe 10, 15 people and then crossing open ocean, like trying to travel from Viti Levu to OVALAU, right? You wouldn't do that. But this is what these people are doing just to escape. And so it's putting a lot of pressure on countries like Malta, which is a small country anyway, and a lot of these people are coming into our rescue zone. And so international law, we're supposed to anyone that's in danger of life is in danger, and so to help preserve life, international law says that you're supposed to rescue them, and then you can then process them for asylum or refugee status. And I didn't realize until I moved here how much that happens here and in the Mediterranean. And so it's just opened my eyes to a new type of suffering that happens in the world that kind of, because it's been going on so long, the media no longer highlight it because it's no longer a story, right? And so that's something that still goes on today, is people, there are places in this world that are still conflicted, either internal war or, and so what I've learned is that we live a very privileged life, both here and also in Fiji. I think sometimes we forget how lucky we are in terms of safety. We don't have a war on our doorstep, particularly in the Pacific. We're relatively safe. And if you think about global events like the pandemic, for example, the Pacific's probably been one of the safest places to be. So I think those are some of the things that it brings a reality check that, as much as I enjoy living in this beautiful place, there is that constant reminder of, oh yeah, I am privileged. I have, I'm blessed by having this like, I love diving. This water is amazing for that, but it also, the same water that I dive in and enjoy, looking at the wrecks, it's also the water that takes lives of immigrants that are, that are fleeing their countries. So yeah, it's always a sobering thought. So do you want the short answer or the long answer?
Any answer? Yeah, go for it.
I'll give you both then. So the short answer is lifestyle, and I wanted to start my own business. And the longer answer is, I'll just expand on that. So while I was in the UK, in London, obviously I've been working for Microsoft for a number of years, and I love working at Microsoft. It's actually one of the best companies that I've worked for, in terms of just the way that they do things and the way that they treat people. I am very big on the way that employers interact and treat people. So I think that's an important thing. But one of the things that I've always wanted to do was, I always wanted to start my own business. And one of the things that you have to, context is super important when you understand the actions of anybody. And so a lot of people have always asked me, why did you leave the UK to go to Malta? And then why would you leave Microsoft, like this massive company? It's literally one of the, so for those of you that don't know, Microsoft is only one of 4 companies that is $1 trillion company. So you can't get much bigger. So one of their biggest challenges is it's how to get rid of cash. That's the reality of it. It's like, what do you do with all this money? So that's a different problem, right, to have when you're dealing with that kind of scale. I mean, you can give it to me. I mean, it's normally my answer. I can find ways to spend millions of dollars. But yeah, going back to the actual question. So I've always wanted to have my own company, to be my own boss. And about 18 months ago, I started coming to the conclusion that the only way for me to be really happy was to be able to, it's not money that was making me happy, it's not things, it was actually getting more time. So time is what I wanted, time to be able to do things that I wanted, to be able to spend time with the people that I love and care about, and do the things that I wanted to do. And to be able to do that, really the only option to be able to do that is to be your own boss. And so I came to the conclusion very quickly that I needed to have my own business to enable me to have that time that I so desperately wanted. And so I then had to start looking and thinking about, okay, so how do I go about starting a business? And so for many people that have an entrepreneurial spirit, wherever you are in the world, the biggest issue is money, right? So how do I start? How do I fund my business? And so the thing that I came to the conclusion is I needed to, it wasn't so much about having money to start my business, but was more about how do I minimize my cost so that I can afford to start my business and then continue it. And so living in London is one of the most expensive cities in the world. But I think it's competing quite closely with cities like Auckland and Sydney. So, I mean, all are very expensive. So the thing that sometimes for listeners that might be in BT, that you mightn't necessarily think about is that I'll just list off some of the expenses that you have to take into account, and I'll give you an idea of the type of money that I was having to spend on a monthly basis. So my rent, for example, for a 2-bedroom, I like nice things as well, so keep this in mind. So for a 2-bedroom place in London, in a not the best, but not the, like a nice and average neighborhood, I was paying about £1,500 per month. Okay, so that's not your only expense. You then have to pay council tax on top. So council tax covers things like rubbish services, emergency services, etc. So on top of that, that was about £150 a month. Then you have to pay for your utilities, so water, power, and gas. And so that on average in the UK is quite high. I was paying anywhere between 50 to 100 per month. So you see that soon starts creeping up. So before long, your monthly expenses, just so that you can live, and at this stage, we haven't even paid for my mobile bill or my internet access, which again is another 20 to 50 pounds per month. And so quite quickly you get to close to £2,000. So when you translate that into Fijian dollars, that's like, how many of you are willing to pay for 4,000 Fijian per month for accommodation? And that's just accommodation. I haven't even fed myself at this stage. So, right? And I like my food, as does every other Fijian, or Pacific Islander for that matter. So, food, thankfully, is actually one of the cheaper things. So it's quite easy to feed yourself, or from my perspective, in the UK. But to be able to get to work or to go anywhere, you have to cover transportation. Transportation in the UK is the next, after accommodation, that's your next biggest expense. So on average per month, I was spending about £250 on transportation, right? So already we're close. And then when you add food into that, and I haven't even got any clothes on at this stage either. So by the time that I add clothes, do you see, like, you're close to £2,500 that you're spending. So that's close to 5,000 Fijian per month that you're spending. So when I hear people going, oh my goodness, you must be wealthy, like you get such a big salary. Yes, my salary goes on all these living expenses that I've had. Like, my savings is literally that at the end of the day. So so it's something that I'm very passionate about. Is I feel sometimes those of us that live overseas, with our Facebook pictures, our Instagram pictures, our Snapchat pictures and videos, we kind of tell a very nice, happy story about how lovely life is overseas. I'm now giving you the reality of how much things cost, right? So if you don't have a job that pays more than $50,000 per year, you cannot afford to live. You have to have a dual income household, or you have to severely reduce your lifestyle to be able to afford to live in cities like London, Sydney, and Auckland. So that's just something to think about if you're thinking about doing things like migrating or even wanting to travel. Honestly, London is a great city to be based in. There's always something going on. It's very easy to travel to other countries, which is why I loved living there. But there's also the downside, which is the reality of you have to work to be able to earn money to cover those expenses. And with all Western lifestyles, it's that working that creates stress. You live a very sedentary lifestyle, like you're sitting down all day, you gain weight, And then you start having all of these lifestyle diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, and unfortunately, I know that my friends and family, these are real issues that are facing people in Fiji today and other Pacific Island countries. Why? Because they've adopted the Western lifestyle. So my point is that I wanted to get rid of, I wanted to change that. So I wanted to get back to a more active lifestyle. And the only way that I could do that was I needed more time, right? Because to be able to commute most days was anywhere from an hour to 2 hours one way. So half of my day was not actually at work, was actually just in my commute time. So that's the reality of what life is like overseas. And sometimes we miss seeing the reality because no one posts pictures of them sitting in awful traffic or having to commute on a smelly, hot underground system in the middle of summer, right? It's not nice, it's not pleasant. But everyone thinks that, oh my goodness, it'd be so amazing. It is amazing, but you also have to take the bad things, the consequences of making that choice. So to take a break from that and reduce my costs severely, increase my satisfaction in terms of a simpler lifestyle. And that's why I like the Mediterranean. And Malta for me ticked a lot of boxes in terms of it was cheaper than the UK, English speaking, so that was helpful for me. So English is actually an official language here in Malta, and that's because of the British. So Malta is part of the Commonwealth as well. So it also used to be a British territory, back in the 60s. And so that was one of the other reasons that I decided Malta. And because it's also, up until February this year, connections to the rest of the world is actually really, really good from Malta in terms of cheap flights. So I love traveling and I wanted to explore Europe. So I'll give you an example. So to be able to, last October, I went on a trip around Europe with one of my friends, and we paid for flights from Italy to Malta, and the flight is like about the same length of time from Nandi to Taveuni, right? How much does Fiji Airways charge for that flight? They charge something like 200. It's like $250 Fijian, right? Which I still don't understand their pricing for that.
Exactly.
But I can fly on a company like Ryanair for 10 euros.
Wow.
Exactly. So 10 euros. So if you translate that into Fiji dollars, that's $30, right? So this is why I don't understand why Fiji Airways charge so much for the same length of flight. I'm sure that there's some operational things, but I'm sure that money has a lot to do with it as well. But that's one of the things that I love about Europe is that, we don't know what it's going to be like post COVID-19.
Yeah.
Prior to, flights are very cheap to do travel within the European Union. So that was one of the things that I absolutely loved about it. So those were kind of my biggest deciding factors. And for me, one of the things that I found really difficult, especially in London, was the amount of daylight. One thing you get is, for example, in the middle of winter in the UK and London, because of it where it sits in relation to the equator, it gets dark. Starts getting dark at 3:15 in the afternoon. So the further north that you go in Europe, when it comes to winter, the earlier in the day it becomes dark. And so for me, having 6 hours of natural light in the middle of winter was something that I found quite difficult. And for me especially, if I was at work, like if I was leaving home and getting to the office at 9 o'clock and then leaving at 5, I would go a whole day, unless I went out during my lunch hour, I would not actually see natural light. It would be the light all the time. And so for me, that I just couldn't, that's something that I wasn't happy with. And here in Malta, we have 300 days of sunshine on average every year. So a lot happier. Sure, I mean, there's been so many challenges. We'd be here all day if I talked through every single one. I think the biggest one. Yeah, I think the biggest ones would be is learning and integrating into a culture and a society. And one of the things that I've always felt drawn to do is, whenever I've lived in a country or a community, is I've never wanted to be part of what is often considered the expatriate community or the foreign community, because I feel like you lose some of the richness of the benefit of being in the country, right? What's the point of moving to a country and then not integrating with it? And I understand why people want to congregate in communities, because you have that familiarity with people like yourself. I'm the opposite. I like to go in and embed myself and understand what it's like for local people and kind of get more of an authentic experience when I move countries. And so for me, I've always, that in itself is something that I wanted to do, but it also comes with challenges in terms of, so the older you get, how do you make friends, or how do you connect with people in that community? Because keep in mind, when you're young, you're naturally meeting people through school or through education institutions, right? That's where you often make friendships and form friendships. When you get older, it's at the workplace. So when you go to a new company and you join them, your work colleagues become your work family, and you become friends often outside of work as well. So that's the second place that you make friendships. But when, like what I did is, so when I moved to Malta, I think one of the biggest challenges for me is because I started my own business, I didn't have that really network of work family to be able to start integrating with. So I had to start thinking about doing different things, like going to networking events, going to groups on Facebook, and so I started looking at other interests, like whether it was diving or hiking. And so I've joined groups like that just so that I could meet people that share similar interests. So then I have a starting point for meeting people that are in my local community. So the things that has been quite difficult. The older that you get, the harder it is, because the reality is, and I'm exactly the same, is at a certain age, and I think for me it was probably about 25, I don't need any more friends. Like, I've got enough. And even the ones that I have, I'm like, I sometimes reevaluate, do I really want you to still be my friend? It's like, what are you contributing to my life?
Those are really, really good questions, even for, friends. I won't talk about friends on social media, that's a different story. But even, friends. Exactly. So, wow. No, I really, really like that. That's a very, healthy way of, adapting yourself into a new environment and getting to know your local community. And even as you said, you can make new friends. Maybe some of the ones that you've left behind, they're still your friends. But, this world, our life is getting shorter. So, make new friends and learn new things. I love that. Thank you for that.
I think the other thing that I would just quickly mention is that the thing that I've learned is it doesn't matter who I talk to and what culture, everyone has the same hopes and dreams, and everyone wants the same for their families. And it doesn't matter who you are, what your socioeconomic background is, everyone essentially wants similar things. They want to lead a happy and healthy life. The thing that I find ironic about it is that our choices that we make aren't things that lead to a happy and a healthy life. I think probably the biggest blessing was being able to have people. It's probably, I would say, it's the people that you have in your life, and I believe that you have people come into your life at certain points for different things, and that can sometimes be to challenge you to think differently. You mightn't see them as a blessing to start with, but when you have hindsight, or when you have the ability to look back, you see that they were necessary to be able to trigger or do something, to be that catalyst for change, to take you in the direction that you needed to go. So I'm a big believer that sometimes blessings are things that we sometimes think are actually curses. And I've had, some of those things have been people that have told me you cannot do something. Because when someone's told me you cannot do something, that's when I'm like, I'm going to prove you wrong. And so that's given me the fire to go and do it, right? And so for me, the blessing has been that person that's been the naysayer to say, no, you can't do that, or that's going to be too difficult. And I'm like, no, I will do that.
I like that, Tony, because that's exactly the way I operate too. And my husband and my kids, they know that. When someone say no to me, that's when my brain goes on full speed mode.
Yeah. I always think about, like, a no means that you just haven't said yes yet.
I love that. Wow.
How can I help you make you say yes?
Wow.
I would say two things. Be curious and always seek knowledge. And I would say that's not just advice for youth, but it's something that we should be doing. Learning is not like saying I went to school or I went to university, I've learned all I can. No. That school and university is just the beginning of our education. I think sometimes we're very binary in thinking that education happens within the classroom wall. No, it doesn't. Real education happens throughout a lifetime. And so the one thing that I would say is keep being curious, keep asking, seek understanding why. Like, if you see something happening, ask yourself, why is that happening? If you don't know, if you struggle to interpret, ask other people, why are we seeing this? Because until people start questioning why, or asking that why question, you're always just going to think, okay, this is how things have always been done, whether or not that's the best way or not. And sometimes it is the best way, but you should always revalidate to see, is that still true? Is that still something that needs to be done? Or can we do something differently?
Wow. Woohoo! Man, Vinaka Tony, for those words of wisdom. And I love the fact that, you mentioned that it's not just for youths, but it's also for, parents and adults who are listening in. That gift of being curious, right? And learning new things. There's so much to enjoy in this world. Vinaka Tony, for sharing those words of wisdom with us and sharing your Talanoa with us. As I mentioned before, I might come back knocking on your door, if that's okay, to do a Tony Namulo part 2, especially with some of your own experiences of living in Malta, or even in your area of work, in computer software field. And I'm sure there will be some young Fijians out there who may be interested to follow your footsteps. If that's okay with you, that I come back to you and have another Talanoa.
You're more than welcome.